All right, so we're back and ready to tackle more vocab for the Chinese postgraduate entrance exam.
You know, it's a huge hurdle for a lot of students.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And today we're looking at this guide, Day 5, Unit 2.
Sounds pretty specific.
Well, it is. It's all about making those key words stick, not just memorizing them for the test, but really understanding them.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? I mean, anyone can cram, but to really excel, you need to internalize this stuff.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to try to do today.
I like it. Let's dive in.
So this guide kicks off with agents and clients, section 1.
Okay, pretty basic concepts, right?
You'd think so, but the exam can twist things up.
True, true. They love to test those subtle nuances.
So let's start with agent itself.
All right, so agent is a noun, of course, and it basically means someone who acts on behalf of someone else or another entity.
Makes sense, like a real estate agent, right? Finding you the perfect house.
Exactly, or like a literary agent who represents authors.
Right, so how would the exam actually test this word?
Well, they might give you a complex sentence and ask you to identify who the agent is.
Okay, so it's not just about knowing the definition, it's about being able to apply it.
Precisely. And this guide has this cool mnemonic for agent. It's,
Oh, that's clever. It means close to him, right?
yeah, so you can visualize the agent always being close to their client, working on their behalf.
I like it. Makes it easier to remember.
And then we have agency.
Okay, that one always confuses me a bit.
Yeah, it has a couple of different meanings.
Which is exactly what the exam loves to exploit.
Oh, for sure. So agency can refer to a company or an organization that employs agents.
Like a talent agency.
Exactly. But it can also mean the ability to act independently to make choices.
Ah, okay, so it's like having control over your own actions.
So the exam could use agency in either sense.
Tricky, tricky. So we got to be careful about the context.
Always pay attention to the context.
Okay, now what about client? Seems pretty straightforward.
It does, but there are subtle differences that the exam might try to catch you on.
Oh, I bet, like what?
Well, client typically refers to someone using the services of a professional or a company.
Okay, like a lawyer's client.
Exactly. But the exam might try to trick you by using customer instead.
Which sounds very similar.
Right, but customer is more general. It could be anyone buying anything from a shop.
Ah, I see. So there's a difference in the level of formality.
Precisely, client implies a more professional relationship.
Okay, so even seemingly simple words can have these hidden depths.
And that's exactly what this guide helps you uncover.
This is making me rethink my whole vocabulary study approach.
It's all about those details, the things you might overlook.
I'm definitely starting to see that. Now, before we move on from agents and clients, is there anything else we should keep in mind?
Yeah, one more thing, deputy.
Okay, so that's like a substitute, right?
Exactly, someone who acts in place of another person, usually in an official setting.
Like a deputy sheriff.
Yep, or a deputy chief, as the guide mentions.
So the exam might throw in synonyms or related terms to see if we really understand the concept.
Exactly. Be prepared to think on your feet.
Got it. So we've tackled those key players in the business world. Now let's move on to section 2.
Which is,
Customs and convention.
oh boy, those are notorious for tripping people up.
I know, right? They look and sound so similar.
But their meanings can be quite different.
Okay, I'm ready for this challenge. Lay it on me.
So you start with custom, which basically means a traditional practice or usual way of doing things.
Like bringing a gift when you visit someone's house.
Exactly, those unwritten rules that everyone follows.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about customs? Isn't that the same thing?
Not quite. Customs can also refer to the government department that collects taxes on imports and exports.
Oh, right. The dreaded border control.
Exactly, so you have to be careful about which meaning is intended.
Especially on the exam, they could easily switch it up on us.
They love to do that, so always pay attention to context.
This guide is really making me think about all those sneaky tricks they might use.
Like they're reading our minds.
Scary, but also helpful to be prepared.
Absolutely, and then we have convention.
Okay, that one sounds a bit more formal.
It can be. It often refers to a large gathering or conference.
Like a scientific convention where researchers present their findings?
Exactly.
Right.
Or it can also mean a widely accepted rule or practice.
Like the conventions of grammar.
You got that? So again, we have to be careful about the context.
This is making my head spin a little.
Don't worry, it's all about practice and recognizing those subtle differences.
Well, this guide is definitely helping me to do that.
That's what it's all about. And speaking of helpful tools, this guide has a hilarious mnemonic for convention.
Oh, I love those. Let's hear it.
It's conolo plus vention Sounds like one shin.
One shin, as in tattoo.
Yeah, so you can think of conventions as things that a lot of people do, like getting tattoos.
That's brilliant. I'll never forget that.
See, mnemonics can be really powerful for memorizing vocabulary.
This guide is definitely full of surprises. Okay, so we've tackled customs, and convention. Now what's next?
On to section 3, which is all about persuasion.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. What words are we looking at?
Convince and persuade.
Okay, those always trip me up. I never know which one to use.
A lot of students struggle with that. And that's why this guy breaks it down so well.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's unravel this mystery once and for all.
So we start with convince, which means to cause someone to believe something or to do something by giving them good reasons.
Okay, so it's about changing someone's mind or their actions based on logic and evidence.
Exactly like when you're trying to win an argument.
Or when a lawyer is presenting evidence to a jury.
Precisely. And this guide has this really cool breakdown of the word convince. It comes from the Latin root vinc, which means to conquer.
Wow, I never knew that.
So you can think of convincing someone as conquering their doubts with your reasoning.
That's a great way to remember it. I love those little etymological insights.
They can really bring the words to life.
All right, so we've conquered convince. Now what about persuade? How is that different?
Persuade is also about convincing someone to do something, but it often involves appealing to their emotions or desires.
Ah, okay, so it's less about logic and more about feelings.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It's like a salesperson trying to persuade you to buy something by highlighting its benefits and how it will make you feel good.
I see. So persuade often involves a change in behavior or action, whereas convince is more about changing beliefs.
Exactly. And this guide does a great job of illustrating that distinction.
Okay, I think I'm finally starting to get it.
It's a subtle but important difference that the exam will definitely try to test.
So I gotta be on my toes.
Always. Stay sharp and pay attention to those nuances.
This guide is definitely my secret weapon for the exam.
That's the spirit.
Now, before we move on from this persuasive duo, is there anything else we should keep in mind?
Just one thing, both convince and persuade can be followed by different prepositions, and that can slightly alter their meaning.
Oh, those pesky prepositions.
I know, right? They can be tricky. But they can also provide clues about the intended meaning.
So I got to pay attention to those little words, too.
Absolutely, every detail matters.
This is like a master class in English usage and exam strategy.
That's what we're here for.
Now let's move on to section 4, which is all about texture and strength.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. What words are we dealing with?
Rough, thorough, absolute, and tough.
Okay, so we're moving from the abstract world of persuasion to something more concrete.
Exactly. We're getting tactile with our vocabulary.
I like it. So let's start with rough, which basically means uneven or irregular.
Like a rough surface.
Yeah, or like a rough draft of an essay.
Okay, so it implies something unfinished or unpolished.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it can also have a negative connotation, like a rough neighborhood.
Okay, so it's not always a positive word.
Depends on the context, but the exam might try to trick you with that.
Got to be on the lookout for those tricky connotations.
Always be mindful of the subtleties.
Okay, now what about thorough? Isn't that kind of the opposite of rough?
In a way, yes. Thorough means complete and detailed, leaving no stone unturned.
Like a thorough investigation.
Exactly. Or when you do your research thoroughly.
Okay, so it's about being meticulous and comprehensive.
Precisely. And this guide points out how thorough can really elevate your writing.
Oh, how so?
Well, saying you thoroughly researched something sounds much more impressive than just saying you researched it.
Ah, I see. It adds a level of depth and rigor.
Exactly. So it's a great word to use in academic writing.
I'll definitely be keeping that in mind for my essays.
Good thinking.
Hmm?
Now let's move on to absolute.
Okay, that one seems pretty straightforward.
It does. But the exam might try to test your understanding of its various usages.
Like what?
Well, absolute can mean complete or total, like absolute power.
Right, but it can also be used as an adverb to emphasize something.
Exactly, like absolutely amazing or absolutely necessary.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about the definition, it's also about the grammatical function.
Precisely. Always pay attention to how the word is being used.
This guide is really making me think about language in a whole new way.
That's what it's all about, expanding your understanding and your awareness.
Okay, now let's tackle tough, the last word in this section.
All right, so tough implies difficulty or resilience.
Like a tough exam.
Exactly, or a tough decision.
Okay, so it can describe both the challenge and the ability to overcome it.
Precisely, it's about strength and endurance.
And this guide makes an interesting connection to real life.
Well, how so?
It talks about how juggling a career and family can be tough.
Ah, yeah, that's definitely relatable.
It's about finding that inner strength to handle whatever life throws at you.
I like that connection. It brings the vocabulary to life.
This guide is full of those little gems.
It's not just about dry definitions. It's about understanding how these words connect to our experiences.
Okay, so we've explored rough, thorough, absolute, and tough. Now what's next?
On to section 5, which is a bit of a change of pace.
Oh, really? What's in store for us?
Words related to emotional states.
Okay, that's a bit different from texture and strength.
It is, but remember the exam tests you on a wide range of vocabulary.
True, true. So which words are we looking at?
Tender, mild, vulnerable, feeble, tremble, and anxiety.
Let's see, so we're getting into the feels.
Exactly, and these words are important not just for understanding literature, but also for expressing your own thoughts and feelings in the writing section.
Ah, good point. I tend to forget about that.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So let's start with tender, which means soft, delicate, and easily hurt.
Like a tender heart.
Exactly, or a tender moment.
Okay, so it's about sensitivity and vulnerability.
Precisely. And the exam might use tender in a passage about a sensitive topic or a literary text that explores themes of fragility.
Okay, so I got to be able to recognize those nuances.
And analyze how the author is using the word to create a certain mood or effect.
Is this really making me think about language in a more analytical way?
That's what we're aiming for.
Okay, now what about mild? That one seems pretty neutral.
It is mild means gentle or moderate in type or degree.
Like a mild climate.
Exactly, or mild illness.
Okay, so it's the opposite of extreme or intense?
Precisely. And the exam might use mild in a sentence with other words that have similar or contrasting meanings.
Ah, like those tricky word pairs they love to throw at us.
Exactly. So you have to be able to distinguish those subtle shades of meaning.
Okay, I'm starting to see the pattern here.
It's all about recognizing those nuances and those connections between words.
Now, what about vulnerable? That one seems a bit more serious.
It is vulnerable describes someone or something that is susceptible to physical or emotional harm.
Like a vulnerable child or a vulnerable ecosystem.
Exactly. And the exam might use vulnerable in a passage about social issues, environmental concerns, or even personal relationships.
So it's about understanding the factors that make someone or something vulnerable.
And the potential consequences of that vulnerability.
This is getting pretty deep.
It is, but remember, vocabulary is not just about words. It's about understanding the world.
This guide is really opening my eyes to that.
I'm glad to hear it. Now let's move on to feeble.
That one sounds a bit old-fashioned.
It does. But it's still important to note for the exam, feeble means lacking physical strength, especially due to age or illness.
Like a feeble old man.
Exactly, or a feeble attempt at something.
Okay, so it can be both literal and figurative.
Right, and the exam might use feeble in a sentence with other words that have similar meanings like weak or frail.
Okay, so again, it's about recognizing those synonyms and choosing the one that best fits the context.
Precisely, and feeble might also be used metaphorically to describe something that lacks force or effectiveness, like a feeble argument.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about physical weakness, but also about a lack of power or influence.
Exactly. This guide is really expanding my understanding of how these words can be used.
Now let's move on to tremble, which sounds a bit more dramatic.
It can be tremble means to shake involuntarily, typically as a result of anxiety, excitement, or cold.
Oh, I can definitely relate to that, especially the cold part.
We've all been there. And this guide has a funny mnemonic for tremble.
Oh, I love those. What is it?
It's A, which means wearing thin clothes.
So you're trembling because you're cold.
Exactly. It's a silly image, but it helps you remember the word.
I'll never forget that one. Now, how might the exam test tremble?
It could be used to describe a physical reaction like trembling with fear.
Or excitement.
Or it could be used figuratively to describe a shaky voice or a vibrating building.
Okay, so it can be both literal and metaphorical.
Exactly, and that's something to keep in mind for all these vocabulary words.
They're not just one-dimensional. They can have multiple layers of meaning.
And the exam loves to play with those layers.
This guide is definitely my cheat sheet for the exam.
Well, it's not really cheating. It's about understanding how language works.
Okay, fair point. Now let's move on to the final word in this emotional roller coaster.
Which is?
Anxiety.
Ah, yes, a feeling we're all familiar with.
Especially when prepping for this exam.
I can imagine. So anxiety is basically a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease.
Usually about something uncertain or something in the future.
Exactly. And the exam might use anxiety
Yeah.
in a passage about mental health stress management or the challenges of academic life.
Okay, so it's not just a personal feeling, it's also a social and cultural phenomenon.
Precisely. And the exam might ask you to identify the causes or symptoms of anxiety or to analyze how characters cope with it.
This guide is really making me think about the broader context of these words.
That's what we're aiming for, to see the connections between vocabulary and the real world.
Okay, so we've explored all these emotion-related words. Anything else we should keep in mind for the exam?
Just one thing, remember that the exam might use synonyms or antonyms to test your understanding.
Like instead of vulnerable, they might use susceptible or weak.
Exactly. Or instead of anxiety, they might use calm or serenity.
Okay, so I gotta be prepared to think flexibly and consider those different shades of meaning.
Exactly. It's all about those nuances.
This guide is like a roadmap for navigating the complexities of language.
And the complexities of the exam.
Well said. Now, before we move on to section 6, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners about these emotion-related words?
Just one thing. Remember that emotions are a part of life and a part of language. Don't be afraid to explore them, to understand them, and to express them.
That's great advice. I think sometimes we shy away from those more sensitive words.
But they're just as important as any other part of vocabulary.
I'm taking that to heart.
Good to hear. Now let's dive into section 6, which is all about knowledge and ignorance.
Okay, sounds a bit philosophical.
It can be.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, the exam is testing your ability to think critically and to analyze information.
True. So which words are we tackling in this knowledge quest?
The guide starts with ignore, which means to refuse to take notice of or acknowledge something.
Okay, seems pretty straightforward.
It does. But the exam might use it in a sentence with a negative connotation like ignoring warning signs.
Okay, so it's about deliberately overlooking something important.
Exactly. And the exam might also test your understanding of ignorance, which is the noun form of ignore.
Right, so it's about the state of not knowing something.
And ignorant, which is the adjective.
So someone who is lacking knowledge or awareness?
Precisely. And the guide emphasizes that being ignorant is not necessarily a bad thing.
Oh, really? Why not?
Well, we're all ignorant about something. It's about how we approach that ignorance.
Okay, so it's about being willing to learn and to admit when we don't know something.
Exactly. And this guide uses the example of the scientific community, which is constantly revising its understanding of the world based on new discoveries.
Ah, I see. So it's about recognizing that knowledge is always evolving.
And that acknowledging our own ignorance is a key part of that process.
That's a really powerful point. This guide is really making me think about knowledge in a new way.
That's what it's all about, challenging our assumptions and expanding our horizons.
Now, before we move on from ignore, are there any tips for remembering this word and its different forms?
Yeah, this guide has a funny mnemonic for ignore. It's kini, which means one person making noise.
So you ignore them because they're being annoying?
Exactly. It's a silly image, but it helps you remember the word.
I love those quirky mnemonics. Now, what about neglect? How does that fit into the theme of knowledge and ignorance?
Neglect implies a failure to care for or attend to something properly.
Like neglecting your studies.
Exactly, or neglecting your health.
Okay, so it's about a lack of attention or care that can have negative consequences.
Precisely, and the exam might use neglect in a passage about social issues, historical events, or even personal relationships.
So it's about understanding the impact of neglect on individuals and society as a whole.
Exactly. This guide is really making me think about vocabulary in a more critical and analytical way.
It's like a mental workout.
And remember, the exam is all about testing those analytical skills.
This guide is definitely my secret weapon.
It's not about cheating, it's about understanding the game.
Okay, point taken. Now, before we move on from this enlightening section on knowledge and ignorance, is there anything else we should keep in mind for the exam?
Just one thing, the exam might test your ability to distinguish between different levels of knowledge.
Like knowing something versus understanding something.
Exactly, or being familiar with something versus being an expert in something.
Ah, okay, so those subtle shades of meaning again.
Always be on the lookout for those nuances.
This guide is like a treasure map for navigating the complexities of language.
And the complexities of the exam.
Well said. Now let's move on to section 7, which is all about boredom and annoyance.
Okay, a bit of a change of pace.
But still relevant to the exam, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Being able to understand and articulate feelings of boredom and annoyance is crucial for analyzing literature.
Okay, that makes sense. But which words are we looking at? I'm ready to be entertained and enlightened.
We start with bother, which basically means to take the trouble to do something.
Okay, so it's about making an effort.
In a way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But it can also have a negative connotation like, don't bother doing that.
Ah, so it's about something not being worth the effort.
Exactly. And the exam might also test your understanding of bothered, which is the adjective.
Like, I'm not bothered by the noise.
Yep. Or bothersome, which also means annoying.
Okay, so it's all about those subtle shades of meaning again.
Always be mindful of those nuances.
Now, what about annoy? Isn't that pretty much the same thing?
It's similar, but annoy specifically means to irritate or make someone slightly angry.
So it's a bit stronger than bother.
In a way, yes. And the exam might test your ability to differentiate it from other words that express stronger emotions like anger or fury.
Okay, so it's all about those gradations of feeling.
Exactly. And this guide has a helpful tip. Annoy is often followed by a preposition like annoyed with someone or annoyed about something.
Ah, those pesky prepositions again.
I know they can be tricky, but they can also be helpful in understanding the intended meaning.
Okay, I'll definitely be paying more attention to those prepositions.
Good thinking. Now let's move on to bore.
That one seems pretty self-explanatory.
It is bore means to make someone feel weary and uninterested by being dull or tedious.
Like a boring lecture.
Exactly, or a boring book.
Okay, so it's about something lacking in interest or excitement.
And this guide has a clever mnemonic to help you remember bore.
Oh, lay it on me. I love those mnemonics.
It's be full or E, hungry.
So you're bored because you're either too full or too hungry.
Exactly. It's a funny image, but it makes the word more memorable.
That's brilliant. I'll never forget that. Now, how might the exam test bore?
It could be used to describe a person, an activity, or even a situation that is uninteresting.
Okay, so it's not just about subjective feelings of boredom. It can also be an objective quality of something.
Exactly. And the exam might also test your understanding of bored, boring, and boredom.
Those tricky word forms.
Gotta know them all.
This guide is definitely my vocabulary Bible.
Well, it's not about blind faith. It's about understanding the principles.
Okay, point taken. Now let's tackle tedious, which always seems a bit daunting.
Tedious means too long, slow, or dull, tiresome, or monotonous.
Like studying for this exam?
Perhaps. But remember, it's all about perspective.
True, true. So tedious is often used to describe tasks or activities that require a lot of effort but offer little reward.
Exactly. And the exam might use tedious to describe a process, a procedure, or even a piece of writing that is lacking in interest or excitement.
Okay, so it can describe both the objective qualities of something and the subjective experience of it.
Precisely. And that's what makes vocabulary so fascinating.
It's like a window into human experience.
And the exam is testing your ability to look through that window.
I'm starting to feel like a linguistic detective.
That's the spirit. Now, before we move on to Section 8, is there anything else we should keep in mind about boredom and annoyance?
Let me think. Well, I guess the exam might try to use synonyms or antonyms to trick us.
Exactly. Instead of bother, they might use trouble or inconvenience.
And instead of tedious, they might use exciting or stimulating.
Precisely. So you have to be able to recognize those relationships between words.
This guide is definitely helping me to do that.
That's what it's all about, making those connections and building a stronger vocabulary foundation.
Okay, I'm ready for the next challenge. What's coming up in Section 8?
Deception.
Ooh, that sounds juicy.
It is, and it's a topic that often comes up on the exam.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Which words are we delving into?
Cheat, fraud, deceive, perceive, and conceive.
Okay, so we're getting into the darker side of human behavior.
In a way, yes. But remember, the exam is not just about testing your knowledge of vocabulary. It's also about testing your ability to think critically and to analyze information.
True, true. So let's start with cheat, which seems pretty straightforward.
It does. Cheat means to act dishonestly or unfairly to gain an advantage.
Like cheating on a test.
Exactly. Or cheating in a game.
Okay, but the exam might try to use it in a more figurative sense.
You're right. They might say something like cheating death or cheating fate.
Okay, so it's not just about literal cheating. It can also be about defying the odds or bending the rules.
Precisely. And the exam might also test your understanding of cheating, cheater, and cheated.
Those tricky word forms.
Gotta know them all.
Now let's move on to fraud, which is a bit more serious.
Okay, what's the difference between cheat and fraud? Fraud is a more deliberate and systematic form of deception, often involving financial gain.
Like identity theft or insurance fraud?
Exactly. And the guide points out that understanding fraud is not just about avoiding tricky exam questions, it's about developing a critical eye for deceptive practices in the real world.
Wow, that's a good point. We need to be able to spot fraud in all its forms, not just on the exam.
Absolutely. It's about being an informed and discerning citizen.
Okay, I'm taking notes. Now, are there any tips for remembering cheat and fraud?
For cheat, the guide suggests simply using the Chinese equivalent you, which is straightforward and effective.
Okay, that's easy enough. And for fraud?
The guide uses the mnemonic you, which means abundant or wealthy.
So you're thinking of fraudulent schemes that target wealthy people.
Exactly. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it helps you remember the word.
I love those creative mnemonics. Now let's move on to deceive, which seems like a more general term for misleading someone.
You're right. Deceive means to cause someone to believe something that is not true, typically for personal gain.
So it's about creating a false impression.
Exactly. And the exam might ask you to analyze the motives behind deceptive behavior or the consequences of being deceived.
Okay, so it's not just about the act of deception, it's also about the psychology behind it.
Precisely. And this guide is really helping me to see the complexities of human behavior.
It's like a crash course in psychology and sociology all rolled into one.
And remember, language is a reflection of human experience.
This guide is really opening my eyes to that connection.
Now, before we move on to the next word, are there any tips for remembering deceive?
Let me guess another mnemonic.
You got it. This guide uses "uk," which means no bottom line.
So you're thinking of someone who is deceptive because they have no moral compass.
Exactly. It's a vivid image that helps you remember the word.
I'll never forget that one. Now, what about perceive?
Perceive means to become aware or conscious of something through the senses.
Like seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or touching.
Exactly. Those are the five senses.
Okay, so it's about how we take in information from the world around us.
Precisely. And the exam might ask you to analyze how a character perceives a situation or how a scientific theory is perceived by the public.
So it's not just about the physical act of sensing, it's also about the mental process of interpreting and understanding those sensations.
You got it. And the exam might even explore how cultural differences influence our perceptions.
Wow, this is getting pretty deep.
Yes. But remember, the exam is designed to challenge you to think critically and to make connections.
This guide is definitely helping me to do that.
That's what we're aiming for. Now let's move on to the last word in this section, conceive.
Okay, that one sounds familiar, but I can't quite put my finger on its meaning.
Conceive means to form or devise a plan or idea in the mind.
Okay, so it's about the birth of an idea, the moment when a thought or concept takes shape.
Exactly. And the guide emphasizes that conceiving an idea involves creativity, imagination, and the ability to think abstractly.
So it's not just about having a thought, it's about developing that thought into something more concrete.
Precisely. And the exam might ask you to analyze how a character conceives of a plan, a solution, or even a work of art.
Okay, so it's about understanding the creative process and how ideas come to fruition.
Exactly. And this is where mastering vocabulary becomes truly empowering. It allows you to engage with complex ideas, express yourself more precisely, and ultimately achieve your goals.
This section on deception has been a real eye-opener. I'm starting to see how all these words connect to the bigger picture.
That's what we're aiming for, to help you see the forest for the trees.
Now, before we move on, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners about this tricky topic of deception?
Just one thing, remember that deception can be subtle and often disguised.
So we got to be on our toes.
Exactly. The exam might not use obvious words like lie or trick. They might use more nuanced vocabulary like deceive, mislead, or manipulate.
Okay, so I got to read between the lines and look for those subtle clues.
Precisely. It's all about being a critical reader and thinker.
This guide is definitely helping me to sharpen those skills.
That's what we're aiming for, to help you see the forest for the trees.
And I definitely appreciate that. Now, what about this word perceive? How does that fit in with all this trickery?
Perceive is all about how we become aware of things, through our senses.
Okay, so like seeing, hearing, touching, all that.
Exactly. And the exam might ask you to think about how a character in a story perceives a situation.
Or how a scientific theory is perceived by the public.
Right? Or even how different cultures perceive the world differently.
So it's not just about the physical senses, but also the way we interpret things.
Precisely. It's about understanding and making sense of the world around us.
This guide is really making me think about language in a whole new way.
And that's the goal, to help you see the power of words and how they shape our understanding.
Now, what about this last word in the section, conceive? I feel like I've heard it before, but I'm not quite sure.
Conceive basically means to form an idea in your mind.
Okay, so like coming up with a plan or solution.
Exactly. And it also implies a certain level of creativity and imagination.
So it's not just any thought. It's a thought that has potential.
You could say that the guide emphasizes that conceiving an idea is like giving birth to it, bringing something new into the world.
I like that analogy. So how would the exam use this word?
They might ask you to analyze how a character in a story conceives of a plan.
Or how a scientist conceives of a new theory.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the creative process and how ideas take shape.
This is really making me think about the power of language to not only describe the world, but also to shape it.
That's a great insight. And that's why mastering vocabulary is so important. It gives you the tools to not only understand the world, but also to create something new.
I'm definitely feeling more inspired now. Okay, so we've tackled deception, but before we move on, any final ones of wisdom for our listeners?
Just remember that deception can be very subtle,
So we gotta be careful.
The exam might not use obvious words like lie or trick. They might use more nuanced words like deceive or mislead.
Okay, so I gotta read between the lines and be aware of those hidden meanings. Exactly. It's all about being a critical reader and thinker.
This guide is definitely my secret weapon for the exam.
It's more like a training manual, It's giving you the skills you need to succeed.
Okay, point taken. Now let's move on to section 9, which seems like a bit of a change of pace.
Oh, really?
What's up next?
Words related to movement and inactivity.
Okay, that's interesting. So we're going from the mental realm of deception to something more physical.
Exactly. And I'm sure it'll all tie back to the exam somehow.
Oh, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
So what's the first word on this movement menu?
Idle.
Idle. Okay, so that basically means not working or active.
Like someone sitting around doing nothing.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But it can also imply laziness or a lack of purpose.
So it's not just about being physically still, it's also about a certain state of mind.
Exactly. And the exam might use idle in a sentence with a negative connotation, like idle gossip or idle threats.
Ah, okay. So it's about words or actions that are unproductive or even harmful.
You got it. And they might also test your understanding of idle as a verb, which means to spend time doing nothing.
So it's like, I'm just idling here waiting for something to happen.
Exactly. And remember, the exam loves to throw in synonyms to see if you can differentiate them.
Like, what other words might they use instead of idle?
They might use inactive, lazy, or passive.
Okay, so I got to be able to spot those subtle differences.
Precisely. It's all about being a word detective.
I'm loving this linguistic workout. And what about adolescent? I always thought that was just a noun for teenagers.
You're right. It is most commonly used as a noun. But it can also be used as an adjective to describe something characteristic of adolescence.
Like what?
Like adolescent behavior or adolescent concerns.
Ah, okay, so it's about those typical teenage angst and drama.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And the exam might use adolescent to describe a character's actions or attitudes, highlighting their impulsiveness or inexperience.
Okay, so it's not just about age, it's also about a certain stage of development.
Exactly. And they might even contrast adolescent with words like mature, responsible, or adult.
To really emphasize that difference in perspective.
Right. Those subtle contrasts are key to understanding the nuances of language.
This guide is really helping me to see those nuances.
Now, what about linger? That one always seems a bit melancholy to me.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like hanging around even though you know you should leave.
Exactly. Linger often implies a reluctance to depart or a desire to stay in a particular place or situation.
Like lingering at a party after everyone else is gone.
Or a scent lingering in the air.
Yeah, I get that. But how would the exam use linger?
They might use it to describe something that persists or continues for longer than expected.
Like a feeling of sadness lingering after a loss.
Exactly. Or a problem lingering despite attempts to solve it.
So it's not just about physical presence, it's also about those emotional or intangible things that hang around.
You got it. It's about that sense of something refusing to fade away.
This is making me think about language in a more poetic way.
And that's a good thing. Language is not just about conveying information. It's also about evoking emotions and creating imagery.
Okay, now let's move on to wander, which seems a bit more carefree.
Wander means to move around or travel aimlessly without a fixed destination.
Like taking a walk in the woods and just seeing where the path takes you.
Exactly. Or it can also refer to the mind wandering, drifting from thought to thought.
Ah, okay, so it can be both physical and mental.
Right. And the exam might test your ability to differentiate wander from other words that imply more purposeful movement, like walk, travel, or journey.
So it's about that sense of aimlessness or lack of direction?
Exactly. It's that meandering quality that sets wander apart.
Okay, I'm starting to see the subtle differences between all these movement words.
And that's the key to mastering vocabulary.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing those nuances and being able to use the right word in the right context.
This guide is definitely my secret weapon for the exam.
I prefer to think of it as a training ground.
Yeah.
It's helping you to build your vocabulary muscles.
Okay, fair enough. Now, what about stroll? How is that different from wander?
Stroll is more leisurely and relaxed. It's like a walk taken for pleasure or exercise.
Okay, so it's like wander, but with a more deliberate purpose.
Exactly. And the exam might use stroll to describe a character's actions, highlighting their relaxed state of mind or their appreciation for the surroundings.
Okay, so it's not just about the physical act of walking, it's also about the mood or the intention behind it.
Precisely. And they might even contrast stroll with words like rush, hurry, or dash.
To emphasize that difference in pace and energy.
You got it. It's all about those subtle contrasts.
This section is really making me think about how even simple actions can be described in such nuanced and evocative ways.
And that's the beauty of language. It allows us to express ourselves with such precision and artistry.
Okay, so before we move on to the final section, any parting thoughts on movement and inactivity?
Just remember that these words often carry subtle connotations that can affect their meaning in different contexts.
Okay, so pay attention to the surrounding words and phrases to figure out the intended tone and meaning.
Exactly. It's all about being a detective and piecing together the clues.
This guide is definitely turning me into a linguistic Sherlock Holmes.
That's the spirit. Now let's move on to Section 10, which brings us back to the more formal world of processes and procedures.
Okay, sounds a bit bureaucratic.
It can be. But remember, these words are essential for navigating the academic world.
True, true. So what's on the agenda for this final leg of our vocabulary journey?
We're going to tackle enroll, recruit, and register.
Okay, they sound pretty straightforward.
They are, but the exam might try to trip you up with their various forms and usages.
Oh, I bet. So let's start with enroll, which basically means to officially register as a member of an institution or a student of a course.
Exactly. And the exam might test your understanding of enrollment, which is the noun form.
Right, or enrolled, which is the adjective.
Precisely. And they might also throw in synonyms like register, sign up, or join.
So I got to be careful to choose the word that best fits the context.
Exactly. It's all about those subtle shades of meaning.
This guide is really helping me to hone my precision in language.
And that's a valuable skill, not just for the exam, but for life in general.
Now, what about recruit? I feel like that word is usually used in the context of hiring employees.
You're right. It is. But it can also be used more broadly to describe the act of persuading someone to join a group organization or cause.
Okay, so it's like gathering support or building a team.
Exactly. And the exam might use recruit in a sentence about military enlistment, political campaigning, or even social activism.
Okay, so it's not just about the business world.
Right. It's about that act of persuasion and bringing people together.
I'm starting to see how all these words connect to different aspects of human experience.
And that's what makes vocabulary so fascinating. It's like a window into the human condition.
This guide is definitely expanding my horizons. Now, are there any tips for remembering recruit?
This guide has a really creative mnemonic. Think of it as ant plus crew, sounds like can join, plus it.
So it's like even your aunt can join this group and become a new member.
Exactly. It's a bit silly, but it makes the word more memorable.
I love those quirky mnemonics. Now, what about register? I feel like I've heard that word used in a lot of different ways.
You're right. Register can mean a lot of different things.
Like what?
It can mean to record or enter in an official list.
Like registering to vote?
Exactly. Or it can refer to a particular range of a voice or instrument.
Okay, so it's about a certain level or scale.
Or it can even mean the air vent in a room.
Okay, so it's a very versatile word.
But for the exam, the guide focuses on the first, meaning the act of officially recording something.
And how might the exam try to trick us with register?
They might use it in a sentence with other words that have similar meanings like enroll, sign up, or record.
Okay, so I got to be careful to choose the word that best fits the context.
Exactly. And they might also test your understanding of register as a noun, which can refer to an official list or record.
This is really making me think about all those subtle differences in meaning.
And that's what the exam's all about. It's about testing your mastery of the language.
This guide is definitely helping me to prepare for that challenge.
It's like a training montage for your brain.
I like that. Now, before we wrap up this section on formal processes, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Just remember that these words are often used in academic and professional settings, so it's important to be familiar with their formal usage.
Okay, so pay attention to the tone and context of the sentences in which they appear.
Exactly. And always choose the word that best conveys the intended meaning.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I'm starting to feel like a vocabulary ninja.
That's the spirit. And remember, the more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
Okay, I'm ready to take on the exam now. Bring it on.
That's the attitude. But before you go charging into battle, we have one more section to cover.
Oh, right. What's next on the agenda?
It's time to talk about something that's often overlooked in vocabulary study.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Motivation.
Motivation.
Yes. How to stay motivated and avoid burnout when you're facing a mountain of words.
Ah, that's a good one. I definitely struggle with that sometimes.
It's a common problem.
Yeah.
But this guide has some great tips for staying on track.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
The first tip is don't try to do it all at once.
Okay, so break it down into smaller chunks.
Exactly. Make a plan, set realistic goals, and celebrate your progress along the way.
So it's like climbing a mountain. You take it one step at a time.
Precisely. And remember, repetition is key.
So don't be afraid to revisit words you've already learned.
The more you expose yourself to the vocabulary, the more likely it is to stick.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those moments when you just feel stuck?
Don't give up. Sometimes you need to get creative.
Like what?
Try making flashcards, drawing pictures, or even singing the words.
Okay, so make it fun and engaging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The more you enjoy the process, the more likely you are to remember.
I like that approach. And what if I still feel overwhelmed?
Don't be afraid to seek help from others.
Like study with friends.
Or ask your teachers for advice.
Or even join online forums.
Exactly. There's a whole community of learners out there who are going through the same challenges.
That's really encouraging to know.
Remember, you're not alone on this journey.
This guide is like a friendly guidebook for the vocabulary wilderness.
And the more you explore, the more you'll discover the beauty and power of language.
This has been such an inspiring deep dive. I'm feeling a lot more confident and motivated about the exam.
That's what we're here for, to equip you with the knowledge and the mindset to succeed.
Now, before we wrap up this episode, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Just one last thought. As you continue to expand your vocabulary, remember to apply what you've learned in real-life situations.
Okay, so use the new words in my writing, my conversations, even my thoughts.
Exactly. The more you practice, the more natural and effortless it will become.
Excellent advice. This deep dive has been a real game changer for me.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, the power of language is in your hands.
I'm ready to wield that power. Now, to all our listeners out there who are gearing up for the Chinese postgraduate entrance exam, keep pushing, keep learning, and never underestimate the power of language.
You got this.
And that concludes our deep dive into this essential vocabulary guide for the Chinese postgraduate entrance exam. We hope you found it insightful and empowering. Remember, the power of language is in your hands. Use it wisely, use it creatively, and use it to achieve your dreams.
It's about taking those words off the page and making them a part of your everyday life.
So it's like that saying, use it or lose it.
Exactly. The more you actively use these words, the more they'll become second nature to you.
I like that. Now, bringing it back to the exam, how does this section on formal processes connect to that whole experience?
Well, think about it. The postgraduate world is full of these formal procedures.
True. You got to enroll in a program, register for courses, submit applications, all that stuff.
There's a whole new set of rules and vocabulary.
So this guide is like a cheat sheet for navigating that world.
More like a roadmap, I'd say. It's giving you the language tools you need to succeed.
Okay, I can see that. And it's not just about understanding the words themselves, it's also about understanding the context in which they're used.
Exactly. That's what makes this guide so valuable. It's not just about memorizing definitions. It's about developing a deeper understanding of how language works in different situations.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly helpful. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on vocabulary learning.
I'm so glad to hear that. Remember, it's not just about memorizing words. It's about expanding your understanding of the world and your ability to express yourself.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there who are gearing up for that exam, keep pushing, keep learning, and don't be afraid to embrace the challenge.
And one last thought to leave you with as you go through this guide and you come across those words that make you stumble a bit, remember that's actually a good thing.
Oh, really? How so?
Because it means you're really engaging with the material, wrestling with those concepts, and that's how you make them stick.
Okay, so it's like a mental workout. The more you push yourself, the stronger you get.
Precisely. So embrace the struggle, explore the nuances, and never stop expanding your linguistic horizons.
That's great advice. To all our future postgrads out there, embrace the challenge and never stop learning.
Best of luck on the exam and on your postgraduate journey.
And that concludes our deep dive into this essential vocabulary guide for the Chinese postgraduate entrance exam. We hope you found it insightful and empowering. Remember, the power of language is in your hands. Use it wisely, use it creatively, and use it to achieve your dreams.